So far, we've been focusing on slightly more serious builds. Today, we're going to look more at something that is a bit more fun, and that actually has quite a bit of a cult following. And that is the Bowchantress, or basically an enchanter sorceress that uses the unique qualities of exploding arrow bows to achieve her power. Now, before the click away because of an equipment-centered build coming up, it is worth noting that this build actually has several weapons in the game it can use. It is one of the more welcome team players in the game, and it can actually do okay even without the cornerstone gear, though that usually ends up with it evolving into a melee build instead of the bow build you see on screen, with a few exceptions. Starting out, what are the weapons you should look for when you're thinking of starting this build? Well, the lowest level one is Ravenclaw with a level 15 requirement, but it does pack a weak exploding arrow and has some low-end mods. But it is probably your ideal weapon in normal difficulty because it's half the level required of the other really good exploding arrow bows. Though, as we get into Nightmare and beyond, we generally do want more utility in our bows, despite this actually being capable of carrying us in all difficulties with the right support gear. And needless to say, it is generally preferred over the much slower normal difficulty option, Hellcast, which, while more damaging, is just arduous to use due to its extremely slow attack speed. That is why the two more popular and well-known options are in here, with the level 33 requirement Kuko Shikaku being probably the most well-known of the pair, and the one that can, with the right increased attack speed, reach the absolute highest attack speed of the bunch, though to do so requires a lot of sacrifices, and is generally not worth it in the modern version of the game. But with Pierce, Exploding Arrow, and the same attack speed as Ravenclaw, not to mention a massive dose of fire damage, especially once you get amplifying it with skills and items, it is one of the more powerful options in the game. Though personally, I prefer its slightly higher level cousin, Demon Machine, the unique Chikonu, which, while it caps out at a slower speed than Kuko, it is able to reach the 11 frame attack speed with pretty much any attack speed gloves you can find, which leaves a lot more of your gear open for investment. The Demon Machine also has a higher percent Pierce than Kuko, letting you get much closer to 100% Pierce with the Razor Tail belt we'll equip later on, allowing you to decimate clumped enemies like cows and flayers, and by slapping a Nephrune in it, you can get knockback, which can help you control the battlefield pretty easily. Though you could also go for a Shale or a Fervor Jewel and free up your gloves as well. And last but not least of the options is the Brand Rune Word, which is going to be your highest physical damage of the pack if you put it in the right bow, which is pretty nice, since despite sundering, we still don't quite hit critical mass on the minus resistances for the explosions of fire, basically making them support damage for the physical aspect against fire immunes. This is also helped out a bit by its other natural mods, such as Deadly Strike and Damage to Demons Boost, which, for most fire immunes, they're gonna be demons. As well as you can get knockback and free magic damage from Bone Spear with this. All it really lacks is Pierce on the actual bolts, but we'll deal with that later. For me, I tend to stick with Demon Machine or Brand. In fact, for the runs I recorded for background footage, I ended up just having them on swap from each other using Brand against fire immune packs, obviously sundered, and getting some minus resist from gear, and then using Demon Machine against, well, everything else, thanks to the Pierce giving me a nice chain of damage boosts from the explosions, especially in areas like cows. Now, how you progress through the game is pretty much like any other enchantress. If you have the low-level bows already, you can just get the stats for them and the rest in vitality, then start snowballing your way up and through hell, especially if you have the gear to evolve into. But if you don't, you're going to need to consider your weapon, and generally I would go melee since it lets you double dip on the fire damage to speed things up a little bit, even though it's a bit more risky. This is because with the ranged enchant, you only get the percent boost from mastery once, while on melee you can stack it twice. So we pretty much just focus on maxing out enchant and its synergy of warmth for offense, and in normal, that's enough since you can get resist and durability boosts from every other piece of equipment. And really, there isn't anything super necessary along the way in normal, with even items like the usually recommended stealth and lore being somewhat optional but nice to have. Though as you approach late normal and into Nightmare, you will start noticing a bit of struggling, so I would pack in some telekinesis and energy shield around that time to give us some durability. This is because energy shield takes damage as if you were at 0 resist, regardless of how high or low you are, while telekinesis reduces the penalty you suffer to your mana as you level it. So generally in Nightmare, telekinesis will be the big one to invest in. Of course, in addition to these, you should be investing in fire mastery as well, since you will be getting your biggest damage booster after enchant from it. So in Nightmare, if you have an exploding arrow bow, I would lean more into fire mastery and such, since being ranged gives you the advantage of getting away from enemies pretty easily and taking a bit less damage since you should be running and shooting regularly if you're using a bow. If you are running melee, you should actually be investing more into energy shield since you're going to be tanking things, though since you're also solo self-found, you'll be hurting a bit for block rate as well, sadly, so that kind of hinders your durability a bit, so it's a bit of an uphill battle. But it is entirely doable with some patience. Just remember you're playing a non-traditional melee build, so don't be afraid to disengage sometimes. As you reach Hell though, you should have your 3 fire skills squared away with Enchant, Mastery, and Warmth, as well as your Telekinesis maxed out and have started your way through leveling your energy shield to max. And hopefully by this point you will have gotten your hand on at least one of the bows, since taking melee into Hell is a bit more difficult unless you either have endgame gear or know just the right kind of gear to hold on to, and having range is at least a bit more forgiving. But if you are determined to stay melee, then be sure to square away those resists, and if you can get it, damage reduction to go alongside that energy shield. And a solid support mercenary can be a godsend as well, with either an Act 5 Barbarian to tank or an Act 2 Holy Freeze to slow enemies down, while in Normal and Nightmare you were probably favoring the Act 1 Mercenary for her inner sight skill, letting you hit more often. You do want to get some extra strong bodies now. With the bow, we actually have a lot more to play with. Obviously, an Infinity Mercenary is going to be the best choice, well, for both, but if you don't have an Infinity, an Act 1 Mercenary does become a lot more interesting for this build if you're ranged, especially if you use the cold variety for freezing, or you can use a Battlecry Act 5 Mercenary for a similar, albeit smaller range effect with decent tanking support, but you do want to be hitting more often. Now, the reason we care about being able to hit, especially with the bow skills, is to pierce. We need to actually hit the target. Otherwise, we'll just get ghost pierces that do, well, nothing. So be sure to take that into account when you're selecting your support characters, since it is the most common mistake that slows this build type down. Just like it's a mistake that often slows down summoners as well, since hit chance is an out of sight, out of mind type effect for a lot of players. In terms of chase gear, we already got to one part of it, the bow choices we mentioned earlier, which I do favor Brand and Demon Machine for simplicity, even though Kuko is better for raw per hit power. But what makes the chase gear of this build special is that you need to consider some odd things to really ramp up the damage to an extreme, namely actual fire damage, since it travels with the explosion alongside the fire damage from enchant. This means the rest of our gear needs to strike a balance between survivability and damage, with things like fire charms being especially useful. But one great example of this kind of situation where you need to balance it is the boot choices. For maximum damage, you'll actually want Cow King's boots since they have higher fire damage, but personally I prefer Inferno Stride for the fire resistant boost to balance out the Sunder charm a bit, which is a similar reason why for the attack speed gloves I went with Laying of Hands rather than Lava Gout. Even though Gout will not override our enchant and it does provide fire damage, Laying of Hands is just a little bit more reliable and gives us that fire resist. It is worth noting though, if you're using Demon Machine and put an increased attack speed jewel in it, there are more options here, with one of the big winners being a Hellmouth, with really solid fire damage and a few just fun chance to casts, even though they're not amazing levels, so they're not going to do a ton of damage. But I didn't really want to rely on that since the physical damage from Brand is still a lot more helpful against the demons, especially with the addition of Laying of Hands. For rings, you of course want a Ravenfrost for Cannot Be Frozen, since that is a pretty important pick, and its other mods are just not bad either. I personally combined that with my dual leech ring, but your second ring could be plus skills from Bulkathos and be just fine since you're not really using much mana on this build except as a health buffer and teleporting. And if I had to choose between mana and Life Leech, I would actually choose Life Leech to recover from poison a bit after it's expired, since you really won't feel much through your higher level energy shield at the end. One part that is hard to replace though for the build is the belt. Razortail is just hands down the best belt, regardless of where you're farming or which bow you choose. It gives you just enough of a chance to pierce that you'll be able to pull off your chained explosions at least some of the time. Or when combined with Demon Machine, you will be able to do them fairly consistently, provided you have the attack rating to actually hit the target to prevent those ghost pierces. For the amulet, I went with Rising Sun for, well, more fire damage, but a skill amulet is fine, or even just using something like High Lord's Wrath to get the attack speed buff off of that instead is fine, but getting that extra fire damage here is handy, and for our intents and purposes, it gives us plus skills to all the important skills we care about anyway. For the helmet, my personal choices are either Flickering Flame or Wisdom, depending on what you're farming, though I will generally prefer Flickering Flame, with its fire resist aura, which will pump up your fire resist significantly, and could even free up an equipment slot elsewhere if you want by counteracting the hell difficulty penalty itself. Flickering Flame is also handy in that it packs plus fire skills and fire resist piercing, and while there are some potential GG rares or magic circlets that could be comparable to this is just simpler and realistic to trade for and find the resources for without having to get a bunch of rainbow facets and very specific rares or magic items. Last up is the choice of armor. Personally, I'm using Dragon here mostly for fun, but it does give us more fire damage for our attack, and since we're using a fairly sturdy energy shield setup, we're fine with our resist being absolute garbage. If you want more durability, obviously something like Chains of Honor will be a really big go-to, but there are some budget options that are nice, and you could go for Enigma for a bit of Magic Find if you really want, but really, I think actual Magic Find is a bit overrated unless you're hunting for very specific uniques, which by the time you have this kind of gear, you usually are not. So, have you ever tried a Bowchantress before, or do you stick with the Tesla Sorceress or Double Dragon Sorceress in Melee? Or does this seem too much like a 4-dimensional peg in a 3-dimensional hole? Mention it down below and check out a slightly more reasonable build on screen now, and if you'd like to check out the videos without YouTube's god-awful compression and without ads, or you just want to support the channel, check out the Patreon as well.